Welcome to this video version of the user group event presented by Cortell Australia on the 19th through 21st of March 2019 in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. We've created this video for those of you who maybe missed the event, those that were present and just want to review the material in detail, and that one guy up the back of the room who I'm pretty sure nodded off while I was presenting and missed the entire thing. You know who you are. My name's Harvey, and today we're just going to go through a few tips and tricks that you can use while working with IBM Planning Analytics. So it's pretty likely that you're either a finance user, IT, or some other discipline, and you're not a graphic designer. And that's a pretty common profile of the average planning analytics user. But don't stress, we've got a few tips for you on how to get together an attractive looking book with some good navigation, clean design, and good usability. So the first thing is always design your interface. So visualize what you're going to build before you build it. Don't go straight into the tool and start creating. Sketch it on a piece of paper, go into Photoshop or whatever design tool you have available, just so that you can have a visual of what you're trying to achieve. And to keep things so that they're easy to build in PAW, you want to keep to a simple, flat design. So don't use gradients and shadows and all of that kind of stuff unless you absolutely need to. There are ways you can do those things in PAW. However, it's a bit harder to maintain and tends to be a little bit more difficult. And to be honest, modern design generally stays pretty flat anyway. So if you're using gradients and shadows, you're probably starting to look a little bit old school anyway. And you want to think about how to update the user interface states within the book. So if you've got navigation and you want to highlight which is the currently selected, have a strategy for how you're going to do that quickly and easily in Planning Analytics Workspace, usually by changing the opacity or putting color overlays and that kind of thing, things that are easy to update. And when using corporate colors, try to keep them flat and square. It's much easier to do later, as you'll see. And I guess the last tip is we're creating the illusion of buttons, tabs, these kinds of user interface concepts that people are quite familiar with. But the truth is, these things are all illusions. There's no such thing as a tab. A tab is just a series of visual states that create the illusion that it's an object that the user's interacting with. So don't be afraid if we're doing a few tricky things to create these illusions. That's how all user interfaces work. In this scenario, we've been given a design. Let's say we've got a designer in-house. We're working for a company called Phoenix Finance, and we need to create a PAW book that looks as close to this as possible. So the designers provided 3 individual assets for us, broken down to create the PAW book. There's a background with the sidebar and logo. That's the main asset. There's a tab strip with the correct color that the designer is intending for the background. And there's a menu highlight with the corporate color and the correct aspect ratio for the highlight for the menu. So it's just 3 assets, very, very simple. Once we have our design, we can go into Planning Analytics Workspace. And rather than go through step by step and show you how this is created, I've created one in advance. I'm just going to show you through the aspects of the user interface and how they're created in PAW. So when we're creating a template, we want to create generic navigation. So you'll have, if you have tabs in the design, you want multiple empty tabs, and you probably want 4, 5, maybe 6 menu options. Decide in advance what you think the maximum will be that you're going to need. You're shooting for consistency across all of your modules. So if you've got a design that has secondary navigation in addition to the main menu, then you're pretty much covered in terms of having enough screen space to do anything you need to in a module. So you'll probably use 1 PAW book per module, and each one of those will be based on the template that you see on the screen now. Just use generic naming, consider alignment objects. So you can see in this particular book, I have an invisible rectangle shape here that I can align the menu options to. This is just the image that we brought in from the designer. This is the background. Each tab is a button with a background, and we have an overall background of all the tabs here that's at 10% opacity, as was specified by the designer. Now we've got all our images up in Imgur, and in order to get the link that we need to put the image in Planning Analytics, we can go into this screen, click on copy, and that'll give us a secure link with a PNG extension. and that's what's required to be able to load that image in Planning Analytics. You don't need to use Imgur, but that's the way that we do it for all of our sales demos. If you need a single solid color and you don't have Photoshop or some kind of image generation tool, you can use what's called a dummy image generator. There are hundreds of these online, and that'll create an image for you of any size that you like. If you set the text and the background to the same color, you'll end up with whatever that corporate color is that you've been given, just a single square, exactly the size that you need. So this is a pretty handy way to generate things like the menu highlight that we have in here. In this template, we've got 2 layouts. You may want to create more. We've got a template with the tabs so that we can use that secondary navigation. And we've got one for cases where the secondary navigation isn't required, and it's just got the main menu and a couple of panels that we can use to lay out our designs. And you can see if I want to change the tab selection, I've made it extremely easy for myself. All I need to do is change this background to transparent, which we'll do in here. Change the new tab's background to 100%. And you can see now it looks like that tab is highlighted. It's also a little bit different in the transparency. That's at 75%, so we'll bump that up to 100, and we'll put this back down to 75. And there you go. Now it looks like tab 2 is selected. Likewise, we can just move this around to be able to say that menu option 2 is selected. So we'll just reload that book, discard the changes so it goes back to default. And in order to use the template, the first step is to do a save as, and we can put this in our personal folder for now, and we'll call it Workforce Planning, and click Save. Now we're editing Workforce Planning and not our original template, so that's a very important step. So in this case, we don't want to use our tabs. We'll keep it pretty simple, just 3 options. So we use this tabless design, and we just want to create our 3 menu options. So the first one, let's just change this to salary input. We'll call the second option employee expenses. And we'll call our third one profit and loss. So that's our navigation there. We can save that because this is just the workforce planning book. But we don't want to overwrite this tab, so let's duplicate that. We'll move it back to the start. We'll rename it to match the navigation. So we'll call this one Workforce Planning, Salary Input. And then we've got our first sheet. We're going to need one of these for each menu option. So again, we'll duplicate this. We'll call this one Workforce Planning, Employee Expenses. And then all we need to do to make this work is change the menu highlight just by moving it down to Employee Expenses. And we just need one more sheet. So let's create another duplicate, rename it to Profit and Loss. And again, just move the navigation indicator down to the correct menu option. Now, of course, at this point, we haven't linked up all of these menu options yet, so we just need to do that in every sheet. To do that, we set the button target. So this one needs to go to Profit and Loss. This one should go to Employee Expenses. This one goes to Salary Input. And you need to do that on every sheet. So let's just go through that quickly. So now we have a pretty usable sheet. And when you look at it full screen, you can see when we select the menu options, even though it's just moving tabs, it looks on the screen like we're actually using a menu and highlighting a button. Again, it's all about the illusion of the user experience. But it's a bit weird having these tabs here, so let's get rid of those. So if we go out of full screen mode, go back into edit mode, deselect everything and go into style, we can change the sheet titles to not show to viewers. And so if we do that and go back into the full screen view, now we don't see the sheet tabs anymore and all the navigation is done by our menu. And just to finish off the thought, let's just throw a few views in here. So we just need to open up our TM1 model, find the workforce planning cube, and let's drag a few views on here. Salary input, employee expenses. Let's just put the review phasing view on there. And profit and loss. Let's go to our P&L and get a view. We'll put the default view on. And maybe we'll just customize this so it only shows our workforce planning elements. So we'll just scroll down, find salaries and wages. And we'll just keep all the parent elements up the chain. Click keep, apply and close. And you can see here our salaries are coming through to the P&L. So when we view that, we'll save it and go back into full screen mode. You can see already we've got a pretty cool workbook to be able to enter new salary details, review the expenses, and check that the salaries have flowed through to the P&L. Now, if you'd like to see one that's a little bit more polished than that and has had a bit more time spent on it, here's one I created earlier. So if I have a look at this workforce planning example, so you can see here, this is a nicer interface. We can enter the salaries here. Let's say this guy's 100,000. He gets paid in Australian dollars. He gets paid the same every month. So we'll just set that to even. And then we just pick the company and cost center that he belongs to. His employee type, we'll just make him staff. And then his bonus and superannuation percent. Let's give him 9% superannuation and no bonus. You can see everything update dynamically on the screen, and it shows you the outputs here of his salary and superannuation. We have a report view, which shows us the salary, bonus and superannuation across the months. And of course, a nice chart to show the variation of values across the months. And then finally, our profit and loss view, which shows that the values are flowing nicely through to the profit and loss cube. So that's the kind of thing you can do in Planning Analytics Workspace. I hope this has been helpful, and perhaps for some of you, it'll inspire you to crack open Planning Analytics Workspace and start having a look, because there's a lot of new stuff that you can do in there that you couldn't do in the older versions of TM1.